Okay, so here's what we're going to cover tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about an introduction to executive function, kind of what is it, some basic definitions, sort of level set on some vocabulary. Then I'm going to talk through a little bit of how executive function skills, strong ones or weak ones, can affect standardized testing, things like SAT, ACT, etc. Then we'll move into a section about how executive function can affect college essay writing specifically. Then we'll talk about executive function in the application process, and then we'll wrap up there. So let's talk a little bit about executive function. Kind of what is it? What does it mean? This is a very hot topic in education at the moment. So I think understanding clearly what it is super important. So basically, I like to think of executive function through three analogies. One is thinking of executive function as the conductor of an orchestra. So just like the conductor of an orchestra has to make sure all of the different instruments are playing together and kind of turning on and off at the right moments, everyone's at the same rhythm. That's what executive function does for you, which is it helps coordinate all of the different functions of your brain, different aspects of learning and performing to help them all kind of go together. So that's one way to think about what executive function is. Another way, another analogy folks use is the GPS of your brain. So again, a GPS helps kind of lay out the plan, keep you from going on detours, make sure you're using the most efficient path to get somewhere. Those are all elements of executive function as well, helping you to organize thinking, lay out plans, kind of stay on a path. Another way to think about it is like a project manager. So just like a project manager coordinates different teams, different individuals working on something, make sure everybody's coordinated to work towards the same goal. That's what executive function does in your brain, kind of coordinates the pieces to make sure they're working towards the same goal. Psychologists like to talk about three core components of executive function. And these are pretty broad categories and they can definitely overlap a bit, but you'll see this language in executive function research and writing out in the world. So I want to talk through it a little bit. The three basic components of executive function are working memory, flexible thinking, and inhibitory control. So let's talk a little bit about each of those. Working memory is pretty straightforward. Probably you've heard that term before. It's basically the ability to hold a piece of information in mind while you're using it. And we'll talk about how this comes into play in college admissions process and in academic settings in a second. Flexible thinking, again, just what it sounds like. This is the ability to adjust, to change plans, to recognize something isn't working and kind of try something else without getting too stuck in one way of thinking or one route of completing a task. The third core component of EF is inhibitory control. This is really a fancy word for being able to resist something that's trying to distract you. So this is as simple as resisting notifications on your cell phone when you're supposed to be doing a work project. It can be cover a wide range of behaviors around sort of suppressing your body, your brain's desire to get distracted and instead stay focused on a task. So those three core components, working memory, flexible thinking, and inhibitory control, all kind of come together to form what we call executive function. Going kind of one level deeper, the psychologists then break those three categories into a set of foundational skills, the more basic side of executive function, and then advanced skills. So what are some of the foundational skills of executive function? And these cross those three different core components. The first is response inhibition, which we just talked about. That's really the kind of ability to stop and think instead of just plunging right into something. Working memory, we talked about. Emotional control, which is another form of inhibitory control, being able to manage your own emotions in order to be able to get things done and work through a task. Flexibility, so that flexible thinking side, adjusting to changes as you go through something. Sustained attention is a form of inhibitory control. That's the ability to sustain focus on a task in spite of distractibility, fatigue, boredom, all of those things that want to pull our attention away. And then task initiation, which is really about starting something without procrastinating. All of us as adults are familiar with the difficulty of this one sometimes. But again, it's a key foundational skill for executive function. Then there are a handful of what we call advanced executive function skills that are kind of the next layer up once a student has, or a adult as well, has those basic skills down. And these are kind of the next level. Things like planning and prioritization, being able to lay out a roadmap for a project or a task. Organization, so using different kinds of organizational systems and being able to figure out which of those systems works best and then using them consistently. Time management, being able to budget your time, accurately predict how long something's going to take you, all those kinds of skills. Then there's what psychologists call goal-directed persistence, which is you've set a goal, which, in the college admissions process is pretty clear what the goal is. Are you able to continue to persist through the challenges along the way to get to that goal? So this is things like keeping the goal in mind as you're working through something. And then the last one, which is really a kind of key component and one of the hardest things in many cases for adolescents, is what we call metacognition, which is kind of that bird's eye view, being able to kind of zoom above yourself and analyze your own thinking, monitor yourself, evaluate your own thinking, and being able to make changes as a result. So this would show up in a situation where a student might be writing a college essay, get partway in and start to realize it's not going the way he or she wants, and being able to recognize that, recognize what's going on in the process, and make a change to improve the essay. So that metacognition comes up a lot and is a skill that tends to develop later in adolescence. And it's really, really important for being able to kind of self-monitor and adjust as you go through a task. This is a great graphic from a woman who I worked with over at University of Minnesota named Dr. Stephanie Carlson to help you sort of understand how executive function fits with other skills you're familiar with. So this tree has kind of on those blue leaves at the top, the academic skills. So this is, ability to use a math formula, ability to read and write, and then the social emotional side of things that many schools are focusing more and more on. So those are kind of the skills that we see in everyday life in a classroom or at home. Beneath that are really two sets of roots. The kind of first level roots are these executive function skills. So in order for those academic and social emotional skills to play out and to be effectively developed, there has to be a really strong set of roots in executive function, all those skills we just talked about, to kind of hold the tree together, center it, allow it to grow. Then one level deeper, literally in this picture, is that kind of reflection and metacognition. So without the ability to reflect on how your executive function skills are going, you can't adapt and make sure your tree is growing. So those are kind of the roots of the roots in this diagram. One thing parents often ask is how can executive function skills be measured? So these are all kind of a little bit vague. They're not something you can easily see on a classroom test. And they can be difficult to pin down. So there are lots of tools out there to help you to measure your students' executive function skills or your own as an adult to try to identify, is there an issue here you could work on? Or if there is, within those different components, where might the issue be? So two resources I really like that I recommend to parents. One is a series of books actually called Smart But Scattered. The original was just Smart But Scattered. They've then written Smart But Scattered for teens, and I believe there's a Smart But Scattered for adults. These are written by two fabulous educators, Richard Guar and Peg Dawson. And those guys have built a really great set of not only chapters around these skills, but a bunch of kind of checklists and questionnaires that you can use with a range of age levels to help to identify if executive function is a weakness for your student. Then there's a really great research-backed tool called the MEFS, the Minnesota Executive Function Scale, built by Dr. Stephanie Carlson, who I mentioned earlier. You can find this online. It's free or low cost. It's like a 4 or 5 minute assessment. It's this little task where essentially you have to kind of sort cards basically. And you kind of think as you're doing it, this doesn't have anything to do with executive function. It actually does. And it's got tons of research behind it showing that a student or an adult's ability to do this card sorting task that gets increasingly difficult is a really, really strong predictor of their executive function skills in the real world. So if you're wondering if your student or yourself have an executive function area of weakness, these can be a couple of ways to start to assess that and understand it. Another thing parents often ask is, what should my expectations be for my child's executive function skills over time? So this is some brain scan data that looks at, on the left, a young child's brain, a 5-year-old, then a preteen, then a kind of later teen, and then a 20-year-old brain. And what students have found, excuse me, what researchers have found is that executive function really lives in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. That's that white square on the diagram. And you can really see that the kind of reddish orangish coloring is immature brain tissue, and the more blue purplish is where it starts to get more fully matured. So you can see the entire brain is obviously maturing a ton through this 15-year span. But you can really see, if you hone in on that prefrontal cortex, that even at 20, it's not fully purple. So there are still aspects of executive function that are developing. This is a graphic representation of a MEF scale, that one we just talked about, the card sorting task, and ages over time. So you can see that these MEF skills, these different executive function skills, improve really dramatically through childhood and then kind of level off, but are still continuing to increase as kids get up to the 18-year-old range, high school juniors and seniors who are doing the college application process. So the point here is, kids develop at different rates, kids' brains develop at different rates. The college admissions process, and high school in general, is very taxing on executive function skills. And so it's important to understand that these skills are still developing in most teenagers. Another question I get asked quite a bit is, what's the difference between executive function and study skills? They're sometimes tossed around interchangeably a little bit, and they're related for sure, but they are a little different. So I like to kind of lay out the differences. When we're talking about executive function, we're focused on broad cognitive processes that help us to manage tasks and responsibilities. So these are things like time management, planning, task prioritization, that really are essential for everyday tasks across all spectrums of life. In order to execute a morning routine and be ready for work in the morning, you have to use your executive function to make a plan, stick to that plan, resist distraction, all those kinds of things. So executive function skills have a really deep influence on overall behavior, decision making, emotional regulation, and can impact all areas of a student's life or of an adult's life. Study skills, on the other hand, are really specific techniques for learning academic material. So these are things like how to study for a test, how to take notes when you're sitting in a lecture, how to outline an essay. So they're very directly related to absorbing, recalling, using knowledge, and they're primarily used in academic contexts. And for most students, they need to be very explicitly taught. Most students don't figure out how to write an outline for an essay on their own. They need to be taught through the course of their education. So obviously, having strong study skills requires strong executive function skills, so they interplay in that way. But just because you have strong executive function skills, you still need to learn study skills and how to kind of put those pieces together. Okay, let's jump into a little bit of, how does executive function play out in different aspects of the college admissions process. I'm sure many of you have students who are in the sophomore, junior, senior range, as I do, who are really seeing these executive function skills as a weakness for your student, sometimes for the first time. So let's talk about standardized testing. So when you're talking about standardized testing, and by that I mean SAT, ACT, PSAT, AP tests, IB if you're in an IB system. So all of these standardized tests that students take through the high school journey that are pieces of the college admissions process. So let's talk about each of those three core components of EF and how they affect standardized test taking. So working memory. So working memory affects standardized test taking, or all test taking really, in a whole bunch of ways. One is through, in math, being able to make mental math calculations. You have to essentially hold some information from the problem in mind as you work with it. So particularly when you're talking about SAT or ACT math, where the problems can be multi-step, the student has to be able to keep the pieces in mind and kind of follow them through in order to solve the problem. Big use of working memory. Reading aspects of tasks, both directions and passages. There, you're really using your working memory to retain the information as you read through a passage. If you're reading a passage and answering questions, you have to be able to recall what you've just read and kind of hold it in mind. Once you get past that set of questions, most of us purge that from our brains and don't keep all of that information in mind. but being able to hang on to it in working memory while you're going through a reading passage, super important. Same with directions. If you're going through a set of math problems and you're not able to hold the directions in mind, that's going to certainly affect your ability to solve the problems correctly or cost you more time to have to refer back to the directions. Anything on a standardized test or any test where there's multi-step questions can be a real working memory tasking activity. So where you have to do a part and then do another part and then do another part. Again, this could be a writing task, a reading task, a math task. Using that working memory is important for solving those questions. Also, multiple choice, huge part of a lot of these standardized tests. Multiple choice, if you think about what you're doing when you're reading those 4 or 5 answer choices, again, you're using your working memory to kind of evaluate them and hold them in mind. If you've forgotten the first one, by the time you get to the fifth one, it's going to be hard to make choices. So, working memory, super key fundamental skill on standardized testing. How about flexible thinking? How does that come into play in standardized testing? It comes into play in a whole bunch of ways. One is problem solving. So much of standardized testing is around being able to read a math problem or a reading passage, understand what it's asking you, and then solve the problem. Sometimes using creativity, sometimes being able to realize you tried one set of steps, didn't get to a solution, and had to start over and try something else. So that flexibility is super important. Being able to take and understand different perspectives in reading and writing passages. Flexible thinking is at play there. There's a lot of jumping between sections and topics in standardized tests. If you think about the difference between a math test in the classroom that's typically focused on one unit or one specific skill or handful of skills, and it's all on that one topic, versus an SAT math section where you're really jumping from geometry to measurement to pre-algebra to algebra to pre-calc, all kind of mixed in. So that's really asking your brain to do a lot of flexible thinking. Being able to learn and apply strategies. So often a big part of the test prep process is understanding, kind of having a toolbox of strategies to use to solve different types of tests on an SAT or ACT. Here, the key is you have to not only learn the strategy, but be able to apply them flexibly and to make a decision about which strategy to apply when. And all of that ties back to flexible thinking. And then just in general, adapting to unexpected questions. These tests are well known for curveballs. And so being able to use that flexible thinking to not let a curveball throw your student off completely, but allow them to be able to use their flexible thinking to figure out the answer to the question and kind of move on. How about inhibitory control, everyone's favorite? So how does this come into play in standardized testing? Comes into play lots of ways. One is just mental endurance and stamina, the ability to focus for a 2, 3, 4 hour piece of time without losing, your ability to focus there. Managing your time. So it's very tempting on standardized tests for many students to rush and kind of take your best guess and keep moving. That can be a really bad strategy in many cases. Often you have to really read these questions carefully. So you have to inhibit your response of wanting to kind of keep going and move quickly. And in many cases, slow yourself down enough to make sure you're getting the full problem or the full passage. Controlling emotions and anxiety. This is probably one of the number one things that can affect students on standardized testing is being able to manage that anxiety and use it for productive, to make you more productive and more effective and not be overwhelmed by it. Also being able to filter out wrong answers. Often there'll be distractions in a problem. There'll be a number in there you actually don't need. So being able to use your inhibitory control not to be distracted by that extra number in a word problem. As well as just ignoring distractions in the room. We've all heard stories of kids taking these tests and there's, somebody who's coughing or wiggling their pencil or jiggling their foot. That inhibitory control is a really key skill to be able to ignore those distractions and complete the task you have at hand. Okay, let's talk a little bit about essay writing and sort of talk through the same things. How do these different components affect a student when they're writing an essay? And this is all applicable both to a college essay specifically for an application, whether that's the Common App kind of personal statement essay or supplemental essays, and also just essay writing in general, because really the process you're using for a college essay is the same as an essay for an English class or a history class. So how do these components affect writing an essay? Working memory. So here, a wide range of ways. One is keeping those spelling and grammar rules in mind as you're working through the actual writing. Being able to use your essay flow and structure and remember kind of where you are in your process using working memory constantly. Being able to revise your work for clarity. So you can't revise an essay if you're not able to hold the earlier pieces of the essay in mind, especially when you're talking about the flow of a plot or the flow of an essay. Being able to go back and revise, take something out because it's repetitive, add explanation because it doesn't make sense. Those are all taxing your working memory. How about on the flexible thinking side and essay writing? So super important here. Flexible thinking helps a student generate different ideas, come up with a whole bunch of ideas to answer a prompt or to complete an essay. Being able to respond to feedback can be very challenging for students who have difficulty with flexible thinking. They kind of think the way they did it was the right way. And if a teacher or a peer or a parent comes back with feedback that's different than what they thought, that can be challenging. Being able to view and write an essay from multiple perspectives. Again, the very definition of flexible thinking. Can they write an argument, but also include counter arguments for persuasive essays? And then being able to get beyond writer's block, that the curse of the blank page, using flexible thinking to figure out how to kind of get going and get started and use different approaches to an essay is super important. How about inhibitory control? How does this affect essay writing? Certainly, again, just the sustaining focus and resisting distraction for the time that you need to complete the essay is true across all tasks. Being able to maintain a coherent structure, not be sort of distracted by a tangent or a different idea or a different story, but to follow the outline that you've made as a writer and kind of keep coherent to that structure and sticking to your plan. So all of those are ways in which being able to control or inhibit that desire to be distracted or that urge to be distracted can really show up in essay writing. Let's talk for a minute about the application process kind of as a whole. So we know that the application process really requires a whole bunch of steps, and I'm sure you can already see from different things we've talked about how EF is going to play in here. So let's talk for a second about researching schools and forming your list as a student. So this is one of the kind of key beginning phases of the college application process is what schools am I going to apply to? Here are just a couple of ways that EF comes into play here. Working memory, being able to remember and process a wide range of information about colleges. So many of you may have done or be planning college visits with your students. That requires the working memory of being able to remember what you saw, liked, didn't like in college A when you're visiting colleges B, C, D. Here, strategies like note taking are super important. I know when I was visiting colleges with my son, they very quickly start to blend together. So it can be really taxing on your working memory to kind of keep those details in mind. Flexible thinking, this comes up a lot, being able to respond flexibly when a college is different than what you expected. Again, perhaps your student has their heart set on a particular school. They go to a visit day or a tour and decide that it's actually quite different than what they thought. That can be difficult for students to respond to. And then inhibitory control, resisting the urge to make impulsive choices about schools based just on a school's reputation or what a friend said. So, again, using that control to be able to complete the research process and really find schools that are a good match for you or your student requires inhibitory control. How about managing deadlines and requirements? Again, not just in the college application process. This comes into play across many aspects of students' lives, but is a huge thing in the college application process. There are a lot of deadlines. Being organized is super important. So let's talk about how EF plays in here. Working memory, tons and tons of multi-step instructions across this entire process. Specifically on the Common App, there are places where you have to fill out your activities section, for example, and there's some really specific directions about how to rank your activities, which ones to include, how to fill it out. So that's using working memory to complete those tasks efficiently. Flexible thinking. So there can be a lot of change as you go through the process, changing deadlines, changing task requirements. Student might change their mind about applying early versus regular, which schools to apply to. Are they going to apply to an honors scholarship or a specific major that has different requirements? So helping your student to be able to use those flexible thinking skills to adjust and adapt to that kind of changing world. And then inhibitory control, again, resisting distraction in general, but also the need for really attention to detail and resisting those distractions to focus on the deadlines. The fall of senior year of high school can be a very crazy time. And so there's lots of other things to focus on socially, athletically, extracurricularly, academically. Students really, in order to meet these college deadlines, they really need to use that inhibitory control to focus where they need to focus. So we've talked a lot about problems in this process. Let's talk a little bit about some tips for maximizing success if, as I'm talking, you're recognizing your student in some of these challenges. So what are some strategies that you as parents can use to support an EF challenge student? Let's talk about working memory and testing as one example. So let's assume you have a student where testing is a challenge and the issue or one of the issues is this working memory side. They tend to kind of get overwhelmed in a problem and aren't able to keep the pieces in mind that they need. What are some things you can do? So here's just a few strategies that you may find helpful. One is just practicing recall. So executive function is a muscle that you can develop and you can build. It's not something that you're born with. So being able to practice active recall, being able to practice different strategies for memorizing and learning pieces is going to help your student to start to build that muscle. Note taking. So looking for ways to practice strategies for annotating passages and math problems. So you can teach your students to underline keywords in a passage if they're doing a test on paper. Even in the digital versions of the ACT and SAT, there's an underlining and a highlighting tool. So helping students to build strategies for how to take notes on the side of a passage or next to a math problem, underline, highlight, to help kind of provide support for their working memory when they get down to the answer choices. Another way is to do what we call a brain dump, which is, let's say your student's been preparing for a particular test in the classroom or the SAT or the ACT. They've been working on memorizing formulas or chemistry or whatever it is. Doing a brain dump at the beginning of the test, writing down the key information and formulas on paper if they can, or on the screen if it's online, can really help kind of free up your working memory from trying to recall those things and then being able to use it to solve the problems. This one seems obvious, but practice. The more a student has consistent practice with proven materials, particularly for the SAT and ACT, the more comfortable they'll be with things like the directions, the format, the setup, which means they don't have to use their working memory to hang on to those things because they're very familiar with them. And that can free up more of their working memory to focus on the actual problems they're answering. Time management is also a skill that for sure can be practiced and learned through pacing drills. Okay, your average pace on this section needs to be 1 minute and 10 seconds per question. Helping your student to practice that timing and pacing so that they're able to, again, not use their working memory to worry about the time, but use it to focus on the problems that they're being asked. How about flexible thinking and essays? Again, let's dive a little deeper into this specific piece and how we can support an EF challenge student who's really struggling with the flexible thinking aspect of essays. Again, whether these are college application essays or classroom class essays, same process. So a lot of these may seem familiar. So using flowcharts or idea webs, helping your student to map out different ways to tackle a topic at the beginning of the process can help kind of activate that flexible thinking. So particularly when you're talking about college essay, there's an unlimited number of ways to approach each of the questions they may be asked, the prompts that they're writing about. Having your student, before they dive in and start writing or get their heart too set on a particular topic or angle for an essay, helping them to do things like flowcharts, idea webs, brainstorm maps. You can find these tools online. There's lots of them and they're really great as a way to help your student think about it from different angles and make sure they're flexibly thinking through that process and choosing the best possible topic. Another one is what we call cognitive reframing. Same kind of concept as idea webs, but it's a little more directed, really specifically saying to a student, okay, you think you want to write your essay about X. What's another way to look at that? Or what's the upside to this approach? Or how can we flip this around and do something different? And kind of asking some key probing questions to your student as they're selecting a topic or an angle so that they've really thought of it flexibly and ended up with the best possible solution for their essay. Shifting perspectives can be challenging. So if a student is stuck in their essay, is not sure where to go next, writes a draft and says they hate it, have them try writing the essay from other perspectives. Let's say they're telling a personal story about their life. Could be interesting to have them, again, just as a kind of practice activity, write about that event from the perspective of a sibling or a friend or a, fly on the wall, and see if having them shift perspectives in the essay can help get them unstuck. This is one many of us use as adults, but reading your writing aloud, hearing your writing can really help anyone, student or adult, shift your mindset and use that flexible processing to kind of hear your errors. So this is a really great editing and revision technique that many students use in the classroom. Adults do it too. And really what you're doing when you're reading your writing aloud is you're employing a different part of your brain to think through your writing and make adjustments. How about one more example? Let's talk about inhibitory control and kind of the application process in general. So all of that organization and deadline management that's required. What are some strategies we can use? So the first one, again, seems obvious, but really laying out a clear plan. Spreadsheets here and lists and to-do lists are your friend. So helping your student to lay out steps and a plan to follow, and then referring back to that plan as the process evolves. So the more you can list out specific deadlines, the more helpful it'll be for your student. And then creating a structured tracking system, again, ideally in partnership with your student, helping him or her to create a system that's thoughtful and clear, that they feel ownership of, and that they can use to stay on track. Setting realistic goals. So laying out a timeline that has achievable milestones along the way, instead of just saying your application is due November 1st, really laying out that, okay, if it's due November 1st, you want to have it in final form a week before that. You want to have a draft ready to go 2 weeks before that, which means you need to have your testing complete, your essays ready, and kind of backing up from the deadline and laying out individual timelines and milestones can be really helpful for a student. And then stress management, again, the emotional regulation side of the college application process and the anxiety regulation side is a huge component here. So helping to encourage your student to build their ability to manage those emotions and anxiety through things like mindfulness, reflection, other anxiety management strategies, exercise, whatever works for your student, build that into the process so that they can really focus their energy on the process and try to reduce the amount of emotional management they need to do. And that's it. I hope that was helpful. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you walked away with some tips for your student, and have a great night.